testing season, no doubt, we would have had to, those of us whose minds are stayed on God, would have had to endure the Christmas season. I know that not all of us are on the same wavelength, and some of us may enjoy some of the trappings of it. I'm not here to pronounce any condemnation on you for that. I know that some of you are gathered because it was a convenient time for family gatherings and such. But we need to take a serious look, as Deacon Ramakan intimated. This is a period between the holy days, and we need to take a serious look at God's plans for us and how we fit into that plan and how we justify the important thing as a celebration of the birthday of Christ. Well, we have been through it many times. And I think the vast majority of people know that December 25th does not commemorate the birth of Christ. But do people care? No, it makes no difference at all. We, as a people of God, know the importance of God's celebrations. His celebrations aren't arbitrary. They mean something, both to him and to us. And the churches of the world and the people of the world have their celebrations. God has given his. And we uphold the traditions of the Bible. Lots of persons who don't normally attend the church found themselves in church on Saturday night. Yes, Saturday night pass for watch night service. Lots of persons wanted to ring in the new year the right way. We're not going to raise an objection to that, although it makes no sense that a day and a year begins in the middle of the night. But for what it's worth, we are here to uphold God's plans. And God outlined his plan, which teaches lessons in due seasons. The essentiality of the plan is God reconciling himself to mankind through the sacrifice of his Son, Jesus Christ. And he has laid out that plan. The plan is captured, typified in Leviticus chapter 23. Leviticus chapter 23 goes in detail about the prescribed worship sessions that God has for his people. And the central part and the beginning of those holy days is found in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 1 to 3. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my appointed festivals, the appointed festivals of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies." So God lays out his sacred assemblies, the times that we are together to honor him and to learn what he's doing and not what he intends to do and what part we are to play. Verse 3 gives the central of all of these celebrations. There are 6 days when you may work, but the seventh day is a day of Sabbath rest, a day of sacred assembly. You are not to do any work wherever you live. It is a Sabbath to the Lord. A reason is given. A reason is given. What is that reason? It is a Sabbath to the Lord. No, all objections to this day will not address that. It is a Sabbath to the Lord. The holy days of God, of which the Sabbath day is central, is listed and provisioned throughout the Bible, started in Genesis all the way to Revelation. It is a system of commandments for us to be closer drawn to God. So why does the world reject or neglect or turn its back on the Sabbath? Well, the church has given them some reasons, the churches of the world. Here are some reasons. It is for the Jews. It is Old Covenant. It is not of faith. It is works as opposed to grace. Let us examine the case. In Genesis chapter 2 and verse 2, it reads, from Genesis chapter 2, verse 2 and 3, it reads, by the seventh day God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So, God rested. Why? Was he tired? No. He sanctified it. That means he set it apart for holy use and blessed it. And his resting can easily be understood that it was to be an example for mankind. So the first thing is that it was set aside for holy use. The second thing I want you to observe is that there were no Jews around. When this was set up, when God ordained it and set it aside, there wasn't a Jew. There were no Levites. And there was no Mosaic covenant. There was no bondage in Egypt. And there was no sin. No sin had yet been committed. So the objections do not address the fact that God had set up the Sabbath and ordained it from antiquity, long before any of the objections that have come into being was raised. The objections will not address this topic. And do not say it is a different Sabbath. That is being disingenuous. So why then the Sabbath? The Sabbath was set up as a memorial of God's creation. It was to remember what God did. And in remembering what God did, there was no Jew. There was no Levitical system at the time. So when you remember the creative acts of God, the Jews do not come into play. Let us examine the case of Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20, from verse 8 to 11. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. This is Exodus chapter 20. Right? This is when the Ten Commandments were being listed. Let us look at what the Ten Commandments listing says. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Verse 9. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor daughter, nor any male or female servant, nor any animals, nor any foreigner residing in your gates. Verse 11 attaches a reason. The first time it was covenanted with the Israelites, a reason is given in verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So the seventh day rest of God is linked. So they are one and the same, interchangeable. And the reason is given why the Israelites should keep it holy. And that reason says, therefore the Lord blessed the seventh day and made it holy. That is their primary reason when it was listed to them. It had nothing to do with their bondage in Egypt. That was not the primary reason given. But to do with God's rest at creation. In other words, their observing of it was to remember God's creative act. But tell me this, how does Christ's death on a cross do away with memorializing God's creation? What's the connection? Why is that raised as an objection? It has absolutely no connection. But the objection about the Jews. The Jews. In Psalm 147, verses 19 to 20, Psalm 147, he has revealed his word to Jacob, his laws and the decrees to Israel. He has done this for no other nation. They do not know his laws. So God was only dealing with Israel at the time. So whether or not they kept it for a period after creation has nothing to do with its relevance for us today. Because they were the only ones that God was dealing with at the time. So what is the objection? It should not have been kept during that time. God had a witness. Israel was supposed to be God's witness in the earth. And as a part of what he expected his people to do, they were to observe the Sabbath. So the fact that they were observing the Sabbath is not a valid objection, because they were the only ones that God was dealing with at the time. In fact, all the laws were given to the Jews, which include adultery, lying, and stealing. All of the laws were given to them. As we delve deeper into this study, we will see that the objection really is about the fourth. All of the objections that there is really is about the fourth commandment. All the things about law, everything, It really is just about the fourth commandments. Should Christians ignore the other laws outside of the fourth? I don't think any Christian pastor will get up and say that. I don't think any of them will say that. So how do they isolate the fourth commandment from the rest? They have no valid way of doing that. The Jews were the only one that God was dealing with. In Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 to 12. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 11 to 12. Therefore remember that formerly you are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done in the body by human hands. Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ. Here the apostle is saying, at the time, look at what is being said here. At the time of the covenant that God had with Israel, he was linking it to their relationship with Christ. That is very interesting. Remember that at that time, you were separate from Christ. When you weren't in the old covenant, you were separate from Christ. Excluded from citizenship in Israel and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. So therefore, it is clear God was only dealing with Israel. So they were the only ones who were covenanting with him. They were the only ones who could have been observing his laws, including the Sabbath. So that is not a valid objection. That because Jews were observing it and we are not Jews, we shouldn't do it. That doesn't make any sense. In Isaiah chapter 56, verses 4 to 7. For this is what the Lord says to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose what pleases me and hold fast to my covenant. To them I will give within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that will endure forever. And the foreigners, verse 6, who bind themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it, and who hold fast to the covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in the house of prayer. The Sabbath was never meant only for Jews. The Sabbath was not meant only for Jews. Even during the time of the Old Covenant, the Sabbath was not meant just for Jews. Foreigners were allowed to join to the covenant, and foreigners were expected to observe the Sabbath. So, we have a case from creation. We have a case of Sabbath being valid during the Old Covenant for others apart from the Jews. So let us take a look at the New Testament. I put it to you that the apostles continued to honor the Sabbath. In Acts chapter 13, verses 42 to 44, as Paul and Barnabas were leaving the synagogue, the people invited them to speak further about these things on the next Sabbath. People invited them. So they were there speaking to the people, and on the next Sabbath, the people invited them. When the congregation was dismissed, many of the Jews and devout converts to Judaism followed Paul and Barnabas, who talked with them and urged them to continue in the grace of God. On the next Sabbath, almost the whole city gathered to hear the word of the Lord. So they continued in that tradition. And by the way, looking back at the creation account, if the Sabbath was sanctified at creation, why would the new covenant remove that sanctification if the old covenant was not yet made? Sanctification, that means it's set aside for holy use. Why would us enter into a new covenant undo that? Some have cleverly tried to use the argument about restatement. I put it to you that restatement is only a problem to them when it comes to the fourth commandment. I put it to you that our opponents only have a problem with restatement as it concerns the fourth commandment. There are many of the laws listed in the Old Covenant which Christians honor today that are not restated. Even if you say they allude to, the way, the mental gymnastics that you perform about linking the Sabbath of the Ten Commandments to the Sabbath of creation, the gymnastics that you perform, you should demand far more detail for the other commandments. You should want more details. So things like incest and bestiality, you should demand more details. Since you want more details, even though it's pretty clear here that the Sabbath of the Ten Commandments is the same thing as the Sabbath that God rested on, but you still want more, why aren't you asking for more details for laws that are not explicitly listed in the New Testament? Laws such as bestiality and incest. Why don't you have the same standard? In Acts chapter 13, I think I went through that one just before. After Jesus' death, shouldn't his closest followers be aware of the switch? I showed in Acts 13 that they continued in the tradition. In Luke chapter 23, verse 55 to 56. Luke chapter 23, verses 55 to 56. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee, hear this, they followed Jesus from Galilee. So they were close to Jesus. They must have known what his teachings are and his expectations. These were not obscure people. These weren't some distant fans, like we have fans of celebrities today. These were people who were close to Jesus. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it, in verse 56. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes. But they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. The people closest to Jesus rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. And I showed you the account in Acts that even after the resurrection, they continued in the tradition. The apostles had many controversies with the Jews. Many controversies with the Jews. They contended in a number of areas. Tell me this though. Why isn't there a big bust-up between the apostles and the Jewish leaders about Sabbath observance? For all the controversies that they had between them, there isn't a single record of them being accused of Sabbath breaking or instituting a new Sabbath. Why? They were in the synagogue on the Sabbath with the people, and no such issue came up. So where then did this controversy come from? Because it was never between the Jewish leaders and the apostles. So maybe it was a case of the apostles using the opportunity afforded them to meet with people on the Sabbath. So they used the opportunity to proselytize. Maybe that is what they were doing. Eh? Because I know Jews were gathered, and it was their tradition, they just gathered there so that they could hold a reason and pull off a few stray sheep. What we see, however, is that when they were gathered in non-Jewish areas, they still continued that tradition. In Acts chapter 16, verses 12 to 13. Acts chapter 16, 12 to 13. From there we traveled to where? Philippi. What is Philippi? A Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia. It was not a Jewish area. And we stayed there several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside, you see. It's not a place where they would readily have a synagogue. It's not a place where the synagogue is. What did they do when they were in this foreign city? On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gates to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. So even when they were not in Jewish-dominated areas, so they could find a synagogue, they still convened and met and prayed on the Sabbath. And they made a note that it was on the Sabbath. Because they would have been praying outside of the Sabbath anyway. They would not restrict prayer to just the Sabbath day. But on that particular day, they made a note that they went. Grace versus law. Because it's a one-off presentation, we won't be able to go into all of the intricacies that surround the Sabbath. There are a couple of objections that we won't be able to deal with in this brief period. So we will, at a kind of surface level, introduce you to some of the arguments that are going on. Right? So we will go into it in depth further on. So every argument is not addressed, but we just want to take a few and look at them. Some of the commonly used objections. This issue about grace versus law is a smokescreen. I'll tell you why. Grace, as interpreted by the churches of the world, is supposed to give some relief, right? But I'm going to ask you, how does grace relieve us of the other 9 commandments? How does grace absolve honoring your mother and your father? I put it to you that slotting in the Sabbath in such a wide argument is a straw man. They cannot deal with the issue on its own. So what they have done is try to lump it. They cannot isolate it from the scriptures. But they fall into a trap because their inability to do that means that they leave the other 9 commandments exposed. And that is why increasingly you hear people talk about don't judge me, because they misuse Jesus' words. Nobody knows that Jesus famously said also that you should judge righteous judgment. They only know that he said judge not, and taking it out of its context. The grouping up and trying to get rid of the Sabbath by using such broad terms exposes the other 9 commandments. In trying to get rid of one, the churches of the world has opened the gate for people to disregard any commandment. Now, let us be honest and frank. There are some parts of the law that are abolished. Abolished in the sense of literal, right? It's literally abolished. And the main one is circumcision. The main one is circumcision. There was a big debate among the Jews, the apostles, and the Judaizers about this. We don't see an argument about the Sabbath, but we see an argument about this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 19, it reads, circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. But keeping God's commands is what counts. So both the circumcision itself and uncircumcision. By the way, uncircumcision is not just not being circumcised. That's not the only sense in which it is to be understood. There was a practice where, because Jews from time immemorial have been persecuted, and that persecution continues today, because of the heavy persecution that they come under from time to time, some try to reverse the process. Now, I don't want to go into the details of how you would reverse circumcision. We will spare that at the pulpit. But they try to reverse the process. So a part of uncircumcision is to be understood that the process, they try to reverse the evidence. What the apostle is saying here is that if you are circumcised, or you're not, or you undo it, it doesn't matter. That is very clear. So unless you disagree with the apostle, that he doesn't know what he's saying, but he's clear here. It really doesn't matter he's saying. No. That is clear that we are not under a spiritual obligation to be physically circumcised. Now we understand that there is circumcision of the heart, but literally we are not obligated to go through that process. That is a clear example. The Sabbath was held in a similar, the Sabbath was viewed in a very similar way. It had the same prestige in the law. Why aren't we given clear signals? There should be a clear signal. There shouldn't be some obscure thing that would, when you apply it and take it to its logical conclusion, you'd have to get rid of the rest of the commandments. Let us also be clear about law and grace. All of the laws were given in the Old Testament. All of the major laws came through Moses. A lot of what was said in the New Testament was to illustrate to us the centrality of Christ. But the laws were there, including how we are to behave with each other. So how does grace do away with all that? Is Christianity to be some nebulous religion of emotion with no detail? Does love have no rules? Here's a problem with understanding the law through the eyes of the New Testament. The major problem, it was how the Pharisees and those other groups were applying the law. You see, they set up rules that were listed in the Talmud. They did that because of Israel's earlier disobedience, and because of Israel's disobedience, they went into captivity. Groups like the Pharisees arose and said, never again. So, in addition to what God had laid out, they set up their own rules to ensure that the letter of the law was met. That was their intention. The problem really of the tension between, the supposed tension between law and grace in the Old Testament, the problem was really Jewish legalism. That was the problem. But they set up their own accretions. In Matthew chapter 15, verses 5 to 9. But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is devoted to God, they are not to honor their father or mother with it. Thus you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition. So Jesus was showing an instance where their laws was in effect nullifying the laws that God had set up to honor your mother and your father. In verse 7 of Matthew chapter 15, you hypocrites, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. This is what Jesus was addressing. Jewish legalism. He did not come to destroy God's laws. He came at a time when legalism was overrunning Israel, and the purpose of the law was being forgotten, and the law became an end in itself. Am I making sense? In Mark chapter 2, verses 23 to 28, Mark chapter 2. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat. And he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." So their rules had done away with what God had intended. Their rules became an end in itself, and they didn't realize that God set up laws to actually enhance the lives of mankind. As Mr. Armstrong used to famously say, when you break God's laws, they break you. So, these rules, these laws were set up to benefit. But what they did in their overzealous approach was that they were making the observance of God's laws a burden. They were making it a burden. And Jesus was illustrating to them these points. He was not laying the groundwork for doing away with God's laws, and specifically the Sabbath day. In Matthew chapter 12, to reinforce the point, Matthew chapter 12, verse 11 to 12. He said to them, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Here was Jesus battling that approach once again. This is how we are to understand the tension of law and grace in the New Testament. The purpose of the laws. They were never an end in themselves. The laws do not justify you. And whenever we reach that point, then we would have lost our purpose. So, again I say, why can't they deal with the Sabbath alone in taking the scriptural route? Why can't they take on the Sabbath by itself? I put it to you that whichever way they try, they will fall into a trap. Because God designed His laws with greater wisdom than they will ever have. So whichever approach they take, they will be trapped. In 1 John chapter 2, verses 3 to 6. This is what the apostle had to say about God's commands. 1 John chapter 2, verse 3 to 6. We know that we have come to know Him if we keep His commandments. And whoever says, I know Him, but does not do what He commands, he is a liar. And the truth is not in that person. So whoever is telling you that you're not obligated to keep any commands, that person is a liar. They are not speaking the truth. Deal with this when you're trying to address the question of the Sabbath. Since you cannot find a text that is explicit as the one I quoted you about circumcision, since you cannot find a matching text about the Sabbath, deal with the broader concept of commandments. And I tell you, you will fall into a trap. But if anyone obeys His word, love for God is truly made complete in them. This is how we know we are in Him. Whoever claims to live in Him must live as Jesus did. Jesus continued to be faithful to the laws that God gave to his people. In 1 John chapter 5, verses 2 to 3, it reads, "This is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commands." This is how we know. This is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commands. In fact, this is love for God, to keep his commandments. And his commandments are not burdensome. This was the message that Jesus was taking to the Pharisees. His commands are not burdensome. That was the point. The point was not that commandments are no longer valid, but that his commands are an act of love for mankind. And they are not burdensome. You see, how are you going to read this text and take and isolate the Sabbath day? How are you going to read this text and isolate the Sabbath day? The Old Covenant. The objection about the Old Covenant. Here's the thing that they continue to ignore about when they use the argument about the Old Covenant. The Sabbath was given before the Sinaitic Covenant. The Sabbath was given before the Sinaitic Covenant. In fact, in reference to the Sinaitic Covenant, turn with me to Exodus chapter 16. Turn with me to Exodus chapter 16. From verse 27. Exodus chapter 16 from verse 27. Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather it, but they found none. This was in reference to manna. Then the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? The Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? So they understood that there were instructions to keep God's laws, which included the seventh-day Sabbath. Before a formal covenant was agreed to between God and the people, before Moses mediated that covenant, the people understood that it was their full sacrifice to be observing God's laws, which included the Sabbath day. Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. This is why on the sixth day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the seventh day. No one is to go out. So the people rested on the seventh day. They rested on the seventh day. They understood that before there was a formal covenant. I tell you, all of these arguments leave the other commandments exposed. In Galatians chapter 3, verses 23 to 25. Galatians chapter 3. Before the coming of this faith, we were held in custody under the law, locked up until the faith that was to come would be revealed. So the law was our guardian until Christ came that we might be justified by faith. Now that this faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. Very suggestive. But the million-dollar question still is, how is this applicable to the Sabbath alone? How? How is this an indictment on the Sabbath by itself? How is this not an indictment on lying? How is this not an indictment on stealing? How magicians work, they don't actually perform any kind of miracle, What they do is distract you. A sleight of hand it is called. So they show you, so while you're focusing on one thing, they switch. So this is a bait and switch argument, that this is against the Sabbath. How do you isolate the Sabbath in here? All right, whatever the text means, it is not isolating the Sabbath. A Sunday resurrection has been posited as one of the reasons why we should abandon the Sabbath. Because Jesus Christ was supposedly resurrected on a Sunday. Jesus Christ been resurrected, even if we give you that, said Jesus Christ was resurrected on a Sunday. How is that a new command? How is that a new command? When the people around him never understood it to be that. How do you get a new command from that? Except that you have imposed your idea on the text. Nobody around Jesus understood that to be a new command. And the issue of breaking bread, supposedly on a Sunday, does breaking bread always mean, though, some form of communion? Because Paul recorded in Acts that on the first day of the week we came together to break bread. I didn't make a note of that text. It dropped off in my notes. But Paul was meeting, and they came together to break bread because he intended to leave on the next day. He kept on speaking until midnight. The midnight of that midnight was a Saturday night. It was a Saturday night. Let's look at Acts chapter 27, verse 33 to 36. Acts chapter 27, verse 33 to 36. Just before dawn, Paul urged them all to eat. For the last 14 days, he said, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Verse 34, now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. After he said this, he took some bread and gave thanks to God in front of them all. Then he broke it and began to eat. It was not a communion. This was a case of them breaking bread, and it was not the emblems. They were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. They were just breaking a fast. So the breaking of bread does not always signify the taking of the emblems. The Passover emblems, as some people said it was. I told you that the Sabbath was from creation. It was throughout the history of Israel. We saw it throughout the New Testament. And when we come down to the end, we see it still being allegorized. Even if you want to say that it's not literal, look at the strength of what is being said as we look to close. In Hebrews chapter 4, let's read from the beginning. Here is a Sabbath being used from creation, the present, and the future. Hebrews chapter 4. Therefore, since the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us be careful that none of you be found to have fallen short of it. Don't fall short of his rest. That still stands. For we also have had the good news proclaimed to us, just as they did. But the message they heard was of no value to them, because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. Now, we who have believed enter that rest, just as God has said. This is about God's rest, millennial, and so on. But what does the apostle use to solidify God's rest? So I declare an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. And yet his works have been finished since the creation of the world. So he's talking about his rest, and they are linking the rest to his creation work. For somewhere he has spoken about the seventh day. So the seventh day is being linked to God's rest. On the seventh day, God rested from all his works. So the lesson is coming through the seventh day. And again in the passage above he says, they shall never enter my rest. So God's rest at creation signified the rest that we shall all have. Amen? Therefore, since it still remains for some to enter that rest, and since those who formerly had the good news proclaimed to them did not go in because of their disobedience, God again set a certain day, calling it today. This he did when a long time ago he spoke through David, as in the passage already quoted. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken later about another day. Verse 9 ties it together. Verse 9 ties the whole thing together. There remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. How did God rest from his work? He took a break from everything he was doing on the seventh day of the first week. There remains, this is double speak, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Verse 11, let us therefore make every effort to enter that rest, so that no one will perish by following their example of disobedience. So there you have it. The Sabbath is tied to creation. Its relevance for what we are doing now in resting from sin, and its future. The Sabbath is both past, present, and future. I believe this cements the case. I want to say to you, brethren, we have to go through times. Christmas is just one of them for those of you who are absolutely faithful to it. But there are a lot of tests that we'll have to go through. And as a people of God, we cannot afford to give up. We cannot afford to give in to this system through despair. If we are to enter God's rest, we must rest from sin now. And sin is a transgression of God's law. And the Sabbath is and remains a part of God's laws. Therefore, my brethren, I encourage you, do not give up or give in. I encourage those who may have not contemplated this message before to give serious thought, that they may have been misled in the past about what the Sabbath actually means. There are some more things that we could add, and we invite you to have a discussion with us about the said subject. I close in the book of Revelation. In Revelation chapter 12 and verse 17, it reads, Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to wage war against the rest of her offspring. Who are those offspring? Those who keep God's commandments and hold fast to the testimony about Jesus Christ. We are those people. We must continue the traditions laid out from creation, exemplified and upheld by the apostles, and come down through his faithful martyred servants from antiquity to the present. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you into the rest of Jesus Christ.